All right. This is a co-authored work with 3 other people. There are 3 Chicago PhDs in this group. I think I am the only one who actually worked with Gary. Jerry Dwyer has the distinction of being the last Milton Friedman student at Chicago. One of the things I learned from Gary, amongst the many, many things, was just how much he loved doing economics. For me, the way I maintain my love of doing economics is I just do the one thing in economics that I love, which is looking at long-run income differentials and determinants of growth. So this is just a long continuation of research I've been doing pretty much since my dissertation. So what this paper does, it has 2 components. One is a data construction exercise. We're going to take the universe of data from the Madison project. Well, it's a subset. We're not going to look at the annual estimates that he produces. We're going to sort of look at outputs measured every 10 years, roughly speaking. And then we're going to combine it with a variety of other secondary sources on measures of labor force, measures of physical capital investment, and measures of schooling enrollments. And in the end, what we will end up with are sort of original estimates of real output per worker for 168 countries. We'll have real physical capital per worker for these same countries for the same years of observations. And we're going to have new estimates of the schooling per worker for these same countries, again, for the same years in which we observe output and physical capital. We have about 60 countries that we observed from 1820 to 2010. So we observe almost 2 centuries worth of long-run performance. We have probably about 120 countries that we observed for at least a century, maybe a century and a half. And then the new thing that we're going to introduce is a new way to compute human capital, which is going to take one of Gary's original insights, that human capital is a social intergenerational phenomenon. So we're going to embed in our construction a way to compute that intergenerational human capital by just taking the time series of education outcomes from the original year we observed the country all the way out to 2010 and build on just that intergenerational human capital model. And what we find when you do that is that the puzzle about explaining the cross-section variation in growth variation in the growth of long-run output per worker or per capita income is kind of goes away. That the variation now can almost overwhelmingly be explained by the variation in the growth rate of inputs and pretty much not require any variation in the growth rate of TFP. So that is sort of the original contribution from what you get by introducing the intergenerational human capital accumulation method. So we have sort of literature and sources. We're going to take sort of the original Klenow, Rodriguez, Clare contributions in Hall and Jones. We're going to use modifications of their original Mincer human capital calculation. 3, 4, and 5, and 6 are essentially data in which the sources in which we're going to use to get our measures of real output, real physical capital, enrollments. The last source is very useful because it'll talk about the distribution of educational outcomes for almost all these countries starting in 1870 that we can take back from 1820 with some initial conditions and match up the moment of the distribution in 1870. Okay. All right, so we're going to construct human capital to start in the standard Mincer manner. We're going to just assume 10% rate of return per year of schooling, and we're going to, despite what Todd showed us, we're just going to apply the same kind of 5% per year return with a quadratic term that implies, in this model, earning peak at 33 and a half years of potential experience. We're not going to vary it across countries, so we're not going to deal with that possibility of doing a better job of creating human capital differences. So we're going to present the data. I'll just present it to you graphically. You can't present 168 lines, but I'm going to construct sort of the weighted averages for each of these regions, the weights being the labor force in the year of observation. So we're going to take the 9 regions of the world that Bob kind of created from his 1988 paper. We have a few modifications. We treat Turkey and Israel as Southern European countries, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. So here's the data. This is essentially what you get. The Western countries have been the richest part of the world for the last 2 centuries. I look at that data and I kind of think that there's sort of 3 equivalence classes in the data. By the end, you have this group, which is the Western countries, the newly industrialized countries, and the Southern Europeans. You have sort of this emerging or middle income group. This is the growth of India and China pulling up Asia. And then you have the bottom group, which is the 48 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so that's what the distribution of output looks. The vertical axis is in log scale, so the vertical differences are proportionate gaps. So you can see that measured by sort of Madison, there was a much smaller dispersion in output per worker in 1800 than even what you see today. So there's, the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution. It started in the West. It pulled the West away from most of the rest of the world. And it's really only since World War II's end that these other 2 regions have shown incredible convergence. Okay? In some sense, there is a remarkable stationarity. Again, if you measure the vertical distance between top and bottom group, except for this very last point here, it's a pretty stationary relative distribution. This isn't too different than what Parente Prescott were identifying sort of before, but measured by gaps, measured in the distribution and not by region. So here's physical capital. We do use heavily the work of Piketty and his co-author. It was the published QJE paper is sort of less valuable than their working paper form. The working paper form had much more data description of the capital output ratio in 1800 for more countries than what they actually report in the QJE. So we were able to sort of do some initial capital output ratios using that for the West that sort of help a lot in terms of the perpetual inventory that we're going to use throughout the rest of the computations. In the end, you have the case that the new industrialized countries, the Asian countries invest at an incredible rate. They invest way too much, perhaps, given their low total factor productivity. But they end with more physical capital per worker than the West, even though they're producing less output. Here's sort of one of the original contributions. This is sort of years of schooling. The distribution of years of schooling, again, these are weighted by the size of the labor force. If you were to look at the United States in 1800, the United States would have been here, but in 1800, it's a very small population country. I mean, you've got about 3 million Americans, but you've got 15 million English and 25 million French, so it's a very small weight. One thing that I always find sort of interesting is if you think of 3 years as sort of the period in which literacy becomes sort of at least at the basic level. So if you look at 3 years of schooling in the labor force as the sort of the minimum time in which the average worker can do some reading and writing, they can sign their name. The West attained that by 1850. And then the interesting thing is moving to the right, newly industrialized countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, they don't get it to 1900. And they're the next group that attains minimal literacy in their population, their labor force. It's not generally emphasized that much in the literature about how much advanced the West was in terms of the basic literacy of their workforce. But when we look at this intergenerational model of human capital, you can see this is the reason why the West is going to pull ahead. They're building on the human capital of their parents. Their parents are already literate, and so they start growing at a much more rapid rate than what Mincer would imply of just a cross-sectional 10% per year return. You can do it for the youngest worker cohort, and again, you see that the West, by 1800, already almost all the young workers, 15 to 24, were literate. So they had already attained literacy of the youngest cohort 50 years before the whole workforce had become literate. And then this is just the Mincer return. So we just take the years of schooling. We have estimates of the age of the typical worker not enrolled in, so they have to be older than 6, not enrolled in school, and under 65. So we compute the average age for a country. We subtract off 6 weeks, subtract off the average years of schooling, and that's our synthetic experience that we're going to apply. All right, so we're going to look at a Cobb-Douglas capital share of 0.33, human capital 0.67, and this is just the solo residual. It doesn't really have anything important to play. So here's the growth accounting that you get from this exercise. The thing that we found somewhat surprising or interesting is if you look at the last 2 columns, this is the share of output per worker growth that's explained by growth in the inputs. And this is the share of output per worker growth that's accounted for by TFP. There's an amazing amount of just similarity across these 9 geographic regions. Roughly 62% is explained by input growth, 38% explained by TFP, and there's not much heterogeneity. These are very different regions that started growing at various different times, and yet in this very simple Cobb-Douglas aggregate technology, input growth is pretty much explaining 3/5 of the output growth. Okay? There's more variation in output per worker growth, but input growth seems to be capturing it kind of very smoothly, at least at the mean. And then when you ask, let's talk about the variance decomposition of those growth rates across the 168 countries. I'm very mean to the Klenow-Rodriguez-Clare formulation. I call it the egalitarian one. But in the covariance decomposition, we're just going to assign one of the covariance terms, the growth rate of inputs and growth rate of TFP to the growth rate of TFP's variance, and then one, there's a typo. This should have been X, and that's A, right? And this should be X hat. And then this is just looking at the capital deepening story, that only the capital output ratio changes are going to systematically be useful for explaining. So if we look at that variance decomposition, we're going to get something that's not too different than what Pete found with his co-authors or what other people found. Maybe this is a little high. We get something like 45% of the variation in growth rates are captured by variation in growth rate of inputs. That's a little higher than what you would find in some work. But when you do the capital output ratio, this is much more similar to what they find. You'd be lucky to get 20% of the variation in observed growth rate differences explained by the variation in growth rate of input differences. Because what I want to talk about in more detail is the intergenerational component, and that's in this slide. So what we're going to do is sort of build on Bob's work and stuff that I did with Gary and Kevin. In the cross-section, if I look at a generation within a country, here's the Mincerian component. This component is the standard Mincerian differential for any group of the population within a country of the same age but varying years of schooling. So we're going to pick up exactly the Mincer cross-sectional returns on education and on experience. what we're going to introduce is this intergenerational component that people get taught by teachers or their parents. Right? So what we're going to use is sort of lag values of the human capital produced by the time series of schooling in the country. So think of this as the average human capital of the parent generation. And then we're going to allow the possibility of human capital spillovers internationally. Right? It doesn't have to hold. You can assume that the rho spillover parameter is 0, and the only gain that people get are building on the human capital of the parents. Or you can introduce the international spillover, in which H bar is really sort of the maximum human capital in the world at that time that you're able to sort of take advantage of, right? And then we sort of play around with some functional forms about what the size or magnitude of this external spillover effect could be. Okay. So what we did next was basically we had to figure out, well, what's the contribution from parents to the human capital accumulation? So what is the intergenerational elasticity of human capital? And so the paper sort of describes a whole range of these father-sons intergenerational elasticities. I showed this to Casey Mulligan yesterday. This is basically from his book. This is essentially about 100 different estimates. This is I think Casey said this is his first PhD student at Chicago growing. So this comes from sort of the CROAC volume in which he has census intergenerational human capital estimates on these. So we're basically taking log earnings of the sons or maybe the children, occasionally the daughters, and we're regressing it on the log earnings of the father or the parents.
This is like Becker and Tomes.
Yeah, this is like Becker and Tomes. And so we're looking at this is the range of the coefficient on the log of the parent. And then essentially this is the median estimate from those sources. And then what we ended up using was essentially 0.375, so about 2/5. Right? So that's how we're gonna have to seed the model with some initial conditions on human capital of the parents, and then we're just going to use mechanically that previous slide, and we're just going to put into school. If we were literally only looking at the US, for example, if we were doing this for differences across states, then we would use, just basically estimates from the US. But we're going to apply this across countries. We can't just apply blindly something from the US. So at least we put in and found different values. We have, it's not reported, but Sweden is in there. Sweden looks similar to Canada. I'm not reporting this table everything that we looked at.
So is this implicitly you're interpreting all of the intergenerational correlation and income to some sort of human capital spillover?
Well,
not
that's
some sort of raw ability correlation. It seemed like it would be an upper bound to me, I would have thought, maybe. If you thought sort of intergenerational correlation of raw abilities.
the correlation of parental.
Because of investments or whatever that were costly, then.
Is that not a pure spillover?
Yeah, that's
Well, I call it as, let me go back. I don't consider this like a spillover. I think the parents are internalizing this. They understand how much human capital they have, and they understand how much it's going to contribute, and they're going to pick the schooling of the children. We're not setting up a model. I'm just going to take the data that we have as sources, and we're going to say, here's the time series of the schooling attainment for a country. We're going to assume that they were chosen optimally given whatever institutional structure existed in that time for the parents and the children. Obviously, countries that accumulated faster, in some sense, must have had better institutions. So, we're going to take the attitude of Daron, which is institutions are primary in terms of giving proper incentives for intergenerational accumulation. And those countries that invest more for the next generation must be implicitly those with better institutions, because the return to those investments being delayed, you believe you're going to be able to reap the benefits of those higher costs today. So We're not making any comments that institutions are not important. We're not going to treat the TFP term as, oh, high TFP means high institutions. We're going to take the opposite view that rapid accumulation, particularly on the schooling dimension, was indicative of better institutions in the past for those countries relative to the laggards. So that's how we interpret it. Again, I don't think of this as some kind of spillover. I think of this as the spillover. This component, I think, of parents optimally understanding how much of their human capital they can easily transmit to the next generation or, build upon. Okay, so we generate, 5 age classes for every country, for every observation. We have the shares of the population in these age categories. We're going to assume the labor force is the same as the age distribution, and then we're going to just age these people every 10 years in the census observation by just updating their experience. This is just keeping track of that experience change. So this is what you get with the human capital. It doesn't look dramatically different other than the scale. The distribution is much similar, but you can see that the gap between the top and bottom in terms of just size of scale relative to the bottom is much bigger. So it turns out, whereas before we could only explain about 3/5 of the average growth coming from inputs, now with the intergenerational human capital, same physical capital story, we explain about 85–90% of the average growth.
But I don't quite understand, why the generational thing doesn't just sort of give a different interpretation for what's going on and it just increases it. I mean, if we just observe human capital from, say, market prices under some assumptions about, human capital externalities, that's going to be invariant on whether, the human capital distribution comes from intergenerational transmission or comes from another source. So I don't see the direct link from the intergenerational to the quantity and distribution of human capital. So, but to put it differently, if you had a great measurement of human capital,
today,
fantastic measurement of human capital. I told you, Germany has low intergenerational and Colombia has high intergenerational. All you would say is that, then there must be some other things. That's why Germany and Colombia have these different human capital distributions, but it wouldn't change your estimates of the contribution of human capital to growth. So there must be assumption here that somehow, because you don't have good measurement, when you know more about intergenerational transmission, you're sort of updating your estimates of human capital or something like that. Does it make sense, my question?
It makes sense. I'm having a hard time replying.
I was asking about, well, he actually had earnings.
Right.
That would be at least something we'd
Well,
want to look at, but he says he doesn't have.
No, I don't have earnings over the whole period, but let's suppose we all agreed that 2/3 was labor share. And we just constructed the total labor share and then just divided by the number of workers, right? That's basically just going to be proportional to output per worker. So then we just say, well, the countries that are the most productive have the most human capital. I mean, with Cobb-Douglas, right? Under the Cobb-Douglas assumption, assuming I have my measurement of physical capital, I'm just going to say, well, I already have that measure because the US is producing 30% more output per worker than Germany. So the US has 30% more human capital than Germany. Okay?
But there's TFP also?
Well, okay, right. Under the
So, but it seems like there are tricks. I mean, Klinar and Rodriguez, Clare use some tricks, etc. But none of this is directly linked to intergenerational transmission, unless you have in the background some structural model that says, because the intergenerational transmission is high, now I'm going to assign more to human capital somehow. That's what I don't understand. So that's where there's something baked into the pie that.
Well, this is the pie. This is the recipe for the pie. It's a purely deterministic computation. I take the times.
You're applying that equation 9. You're going to say that when the raw coefficient is high, you're gonna or beta coefficient is high, whatever, you're gonna assign more human capital to countries that had more human capital in the past,
Right.
and therefore
As long
you can
as they-
inflate their human capital.
Well, I mean, it does depend. There are time series on the schooling attainment,
Sure.
right? So if we observe countries that educated their population faster, even if they started with the same parental human capital in 1800, they're going to pull away, right? Because the mincer builds for the first cross section, but then it shows up in the parents here, and then if we assume the same intergenerational elasticity of transmission, they're still going to have a boost.
But in some sense, then this does make if this structural equation were correct, then this would have some observable wage implications. It would say that, college graduates in Germany should earn more than, college
graduates in
Colombia,
Mexico. I agree.
Mexico.
Yeah, I agree. Here's what I would argue.
Because they have more human capital
Right.
because it's coming from
Right.
their parents
Right.
that were higher human
So
capital than the
we
local
did
parents.
something like that. So Kevin and I, with Curtis Simon, we did this by breaking out black-white differences at the U.S. state level, and we model the fertility choice and the education choice of blacks and whites by state from 1840 to 2000, and then we construct something very similar to this. And we have our state variable black human capital by state of birth, and et cetera. And we test that against sort of any data we get from 1940 onward in the censuses about black earnings, white earnings, and they're very correlated. They're highly correlated with those observable measures of earnings. So we would argue that it's not identical to this functional form, but we've done what you suggested that said, okay, we believe since blacks were discriminated against from 1840 until essentially 1960 in terms of Jim Crow laws, a tiny 20-year window of Reconstruction, that their human capital is severely impacted, right? And so we produce a time series of that, and we can then compute state output per worker by the weights of the black-white shares and the age structure. They're all very correlated. So that's a separate paper. So it has some notion of looking at some ability to test some auxiliary predictions about relative earnings or permanent income differences. We find that our measures of black-white human capital are very correlated to our estimates of permanent income by blacks and whites of the appropriate cohort. So we look at successive census constructs synthetic cohorts for a black from 40 to 90. And compute the permanent income from that cohort.
Context, it makes sense.
So in that context, we do have external measures to
We
test.
could try to do that for cross country. We know we have estimates of Mexican, Colombian, Brazilian
Okay.
wage differences,
Yeah,
and
right.
then
Right.
college premium.
Exactly.
And how
We
do these
could-
college
right,
premium
right.
correlate with the parents' education?
We could do that. We haven't done that in this paper, but you're right. You're exactly right.
I'm new to much of this literature, but let me ask the following. Todd's comments this morning, the way I interpret that means that the education in some of these countries, as measured by years, is much lower in value. You're not, if you adjusted your calculations to his benchmarks, what difference is that going to make?
So it's not in these slides, but in the paper, we take our estimates of the 2,000 human capital produced by this model, by this computation, and we compare it to what Todd would predict to be the relative human capital of those countries compared to the US, and we're very correlated. So, in that sense, if you do quality adjustment, it's not going to do too much to this. So years of schooling are generally going to still capture a big chunk of what we're interested in. We're more correlated with Todd's 2000 output relative measures than Lutz Hendricks's 1990. Lutz has different estimates, but for the 1990 potential cross-section differences in quality of schooling, we're positively correlated with those, just not as strong as Todd's 2000. And we can predict what Todd would have gotten in 2010. And again, we're more correlated with 2010 than 2000. Again, sort of the notion that there's some of this intergenerational accumulation going on. one of the things we get out of this is that it does help with explaining the average growth. If you did not have any spillovers at all, it actually doesn't do any better than without the standard Minserian return. So Mincer said we can explain 3/5 of the average growth. If I put in the intergenerational human capital without any spillovers, you explain about half. When I put in the spillovers, it really helps a lot, because some of the real rapidly growing countries, they started their educational attainment growth before you observe the takeoff in their earnings. So there is some feature that the spillover is important.
By spillover here, do you mean that it comes from the sort of the cohort rather than your parents?
It comes from what they could have accumulated from the state of the art. So how much you can take advantage of essentially the state of the art human capital when you're going to school depends on how long you stay in school. So if you only have 3 years of schooling, you don't get much return because you're just learning how to read and write and add and subtract. If you go to high school, you get a lot more because you get the quadratic formula, you get some basic physics, basic chemistry. You go to college, you get even more benefit. So, you know, this thing is not constant, and it depends on the schooling level of and that's where we get the big boost, is that we get the lead in many countries in rising schooling before it shows up in their living standards, and that helps to explain their future growth in a decent way.
So have you ever tried to just crank up what this gives you, like, think about very rapidly growing economies. So you're, you know, Taiwan, Korea,
Yeah.
China. I mean, they started with very low educational attainment and grew tremendously rapidly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, to me, there's always been a puzzle, like how fast can you increase, if you think about schooling, there's a stock flow issue with the workforce.
Right.
Like how fast can you possibly crank it up, because, you know, you've got the old guys in there who are not getting any more schooling. So if you, like, just crank through numbers for these very fast growing economies and see how much you get out of.
So here's the newly industrialized countries. We claim that we're being able to get 96% of the growth through this.
Well, I'm puzzled because your annualized growth rates for those guys are 1.8. I mean, they had years of 10.
True, but we're picking them up starting in 1820. All 5 countries started in 1820. So their rapid growth is pretty much 1950 onward.
So this is all from over your whole 100 and whatever.
Right. Well, okay, so what we did as a robustness check is we broke the sample in half. We took every country and took the midpoint year from the start to whatever mid-year before 2010, and then looked at that midpoint to 2010 and asked, how does this thing work? It works about this well for the first half. It doesn't work as well in the second half. So it doesn't really get the acceleration quite as well in the second half as what you'd hope. But if you don't have this spillover, it's miserable. I mean, you don't get anything. The intergenerational models can't even, I mean, it helps relative to Mincer, but it doesn't help too much.
Yeah, doesn't that make you suspicious that there's something else very important going on?
Well,
Can't explain.
I can't, well,
The advice of growth economists to countries trying to grow, like, it's sort of, look at Taiwan, Korea, be like Mike, it's just, well, how do you do it?
My take on that, when I look at the first half, second half differences in ability to explain, would be, yeah, there is still something about improving institutions that are a primary effect on TFP. So their allocation of resources improved dramatically, whatever they had, because they became much more price market oriented. And then it also feeds into, the incentive to accumulate capital. So I agree. When I look at the most rapid, if I look at China, if I look at India post-1980, this model can't get 8% per capita growth based on the pure intergeneration. They're going to show up as a big rapid TFP growth. But when I look at it from the long run, it dramatically improves sort of the ability to capture 2 centuries. Again, the second half doesn't work quite as well, but for 90 years, it works better than without any spill, without any intergenerational link. Okay, so this is what I've been alluding to, sort of if I look at this variance decomposition or growth over the long run with the intergenerational accumulation technology. It doesn't depend on whether you just look at the input growth variation or if you use the capital deepening story. You get that roughly 90% plus of the variation in growth rate is now explained by the variation in the growth rate of the inputs. Okay? Like I said, if I looked at the second half, if I did the table for the second half, the mean number is, let's see if I can pull it up. The ballpark number is about 50%. We can explain about 50% of the variation in the second half of a country's data by doing it this way. So without it, it would be almost impossible. It would all be TFP variation. It would all show up in just improved resource allocation without necessarily much input implication. If you look at these by regions, it's pretty robust that as long as you don't have the OPEC countries in there, the oil-producing countries in there, it doesn't seem to have, it doesn't depend on being pushed by a few set of the most, the richest countries or that nature. Which, again, we think is interesting that it explains the disparate behavior across regions. It can explain sub-Saharan Africa with 1.1% annualized growth. We explain 90% of the variation within the 48 countries of the sub-Saharan region. It's pretty much indistinguishable from being able to explain for the 8 Southern European countries the variation in their growth rate, but they have a substantially higher growth rate. We did this with level accounting. We did it with sort of development level accounting, and what you get is when you look at the intergenerational model without spillovers, you can explain about 50% of the average variation in log living standards. If you put in the intergenerational spillovers with, let me take it back, both the intergenerational accumulation technology with the spillovers, you can explain about 60% of the average log variance of log, standard deviation of the log living standards. So, our view is that human capital is not just going to school, getting your rate of return, it's building on what your parents' traditions, your parents' knowledge, or what the state of the art is when you go to school. And that countries that get to 12 years of schooling today will still lag in their human capital for their workforce compared to countries who had 12 years of schooling in 1950, like the United States. It's not permanent, right? It's just that it's going to take them longer to be able to catch up than you would have forecast based on just differences in years of schooling at the cross-section. So to us, we sort of think of this as being another way to show the importance of the link in the families between what the parents deliver to their children, whether in the form of setting up school districts, schools, teaching at home, and then providing incentives for their children to accumulate inputs. And to me, it ties in with the view that growth is a long-run process. It's not just one of, like you said, just all we have to do is deliver a certain number of years of schooling to the population, and then everything else will take care of itself. I mean, that was the old roadmap. That was the communist central planning idea. We'll just give everybody 12 years of schooling, and then we'll be as rich or richer than the West because we're going to invest at a much more rapid rate, so we'll be richer.
They do have literate populations.
They what?
They do have literate populations.
They do have very literate populations, but if we go back and see when they accumulated their schooling, it's incredibly late. So the Central Eastern Europeans are the green, and you ask when did they get to 3 years of schooling? It's not until basically the end of World War II. I mean, they're one of the, I mean, they're still early relative to many, but they're not, they weren't very rapid. The Soviet Union is, you know, here. It took them 30 years to get to basically a literate workforce. It's more rapid than what they were doing on trend, but I mean, here's the youngest cohort of workers, 15 to 24 in 2010 in Africa, and they're like at about 8. So I'm not surprised that you don't see too many African high school, college graduates showing up. I mean, it's a very small share of their population that have attained that. I wouldn't expect if I had a guy who was, you know, let's take a sub-Saharan African who went to college in France and then showed up in Chicago or MIT. Well, I'd say they probably would more likely look like a French-trained college graduate showing up at Chicago or MIT.
Let's see, Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Now, they were, let's say, socialist countries until about 1990.
Yeah.
Was their schooling as good as, let's say, almost Western Europe or the US? I mean,
They had a lot of years of schooling.
pardon?
They had a lot of years of schooling.
Yeah.
Some of it is contaminated with Marxist dogma. You know, they had to take an hour of that every day.
Education they got was just as, almost as good.
But math and science, they would be as good. Yeah. They sorted very early. They tested their kids very early. You showed a mathematical engineering tendency, they just shoved you in. They started you at 8, and you were going to be an engineer, or you were going to be a mathematician. And they trained those very well. So,
Yeah, but the productivity of the country wasn't.
no.
Okay, so it doesn't really contribute to the country's productivity. It contributes to, let's say, the individual's human capital, but it doesn't.
Right, we would still measure TFP. We would still measure TFP in the centrally planned economies as being very low.
Yeah.
So we're not, you know, the data that we see for output per worker is contaminated in the sense that, you know, it's estimated. Most of the external evidence for like the Soviet Union says output per worker probably peaked in 1970. If you look at life expectation, infant mortality, they hit their maximum level in terms of improvement in 1970. The 1980 cohort of life expectation is already dropping. Infant mortality is beginning to rise. 1990, it still drops. I mean, male life expectation in Russia today is below 60. I mean, what I would say that indicates isn't so much that capitalism has been terrible for them. It's just that cirrhosis of the liver takes 30 years. And it's consistent with basically they started drinking heavily in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, and it's showing up today in high rates of mortality for men. It's specifically for men. And they have very high rates of alcoholism and that type of illnesses. So I would argue that's what it's more indicative of. When you see a 58-year life expectation in Russia, it's the fact that they've essentially, those guys dropped dead from 30 years of drinking during communism. I mean, it's consistent with what we see in the US that cirrhosis drops like a stone about the time of Prohibition. But it had nothing to do with Prohibition. It's the fact that we put in clean water sewer systems in the cities in the 1890s, and people weren't drinking hard liquor and alcohol to stay, you know, hydrated. They drank tap water, and that's the population that suddenly has no cirrhosis about the time of Prohibition. So, to me, that's why, you know, we would look at the Soviet Union's data post 70 until about 2000 with suspicion, because it's just coming from, you know, the government records. What we would argue is that putting in the intergenerational human capital accumulation story is very useful, most in terms of explaining the variation in the growth rates that we observe over the long history of these countries. We typically observe a country for about 120 years. The typical observation for a country is around 1890 to 2010. So we observe the typical country for 120. We observe 60 countries for almost 2 centuries. When we look at those subsamples of the ones with the longest data, the model fits even better. Now, some of it is because it's smoother. We don't observe the sharp takeoffs for as many countries, and so that's probably why we do a better job. But I would argue that this is completely consistent with Gary's focus on human capital, Gary's notion that human capital is not just years of schooling, but the idea that it depends on the long time series, the long intergenerational linkages of the parents, grandparents, et cetera, with what we observe as the education choices of the child. And in that sense, I think that's where I think Mincer misses, is that in any cross-section, you'll get the Mincer return, and that's what we pegged it to do. But when you compare differences across countries, you really need this notion that the time series of education accumulation matters. It's not just the snapshot of educational attainment. That's sort of all I have.